Next question. What was the therapeutic approach to my situation from the psychiatrist that I saw? And what were you made aware of in regards to impacts, potential impacts for medical treatments, both to your physical health, your mental health, and your fertility? So, the youth psychiatrist that I saw when I was 20, 3 years into my DIY transition, gave me the approval letter so that I could be prescribed hormones by a general practitioner, which is a primary care physician in the US. I was not given any warnings or information specifically from the psychiatrist, as their only purpose was to confirm the presence of gender dysphoria as a diagnosis, which another doctor, later an endocrinologist, then can prescribe me medication based upon. I was warned of some basic stuff when I got to my GP and later when I saw an endocrinologist. My memory on this is not perfect. It's been a long time and I don't have any documentation on this specific subject that I can pull back. I'm a very research enthusiastic person, so I had already scoured the internet to the best of my ability as a teenager, mind you, prior to starting internet hormones. And so nothing that any medical professional informed me about was new to me. However, I do know now that we all had incomplete information. I know now that people undergoing medical transitions face a variety of unique risks, including but not limited to specific increased cancer rates, liver and kidney damage, immunological complications, stunting of neurological development, and eventual dependence on the medical system to sustain healthy bodily functioning. I fortunately have missed most of those potentials, though all of them are risks, and the actual outcomes per individual are going to be individual. Next question. Did I receive any in depth psychological counseling or assessments when I first decided to transition? I did not receive deep psychological counseling when I first decided to transition. I explicitly avoided getting into environments where that could happen because I was primed by the trans community to expect medical professionals to do everything in their power to prevent me from transitioning. By the time I did eventually pursue official medicalization, I used my status as a DIY hormone experimenter to as an excuse to bypass and streamline the normal safeguards and ensure that they prescribed me what I wanted as fast as possible. Somehow, this strategy worked. Again, I only had 2 sessions with a youth psychiatrist and not a gender specialist by any means in order to get my gender dysphoria diagnosis. I have never had any similar kind of assessment since. No doctor has ever asked me to provide evidence of psychological assessment since. All have basically taken me at my word through proof of past prescriptions. Next question. If so, what are any comorbidities were considered or explored if you feel comfortable to share? My answer, no specific comorbidities were elaborately explored. I'm certain that in my initial 2 psychiatry sessions, I was asked questions pertaining to my family, my sexuality, my interests and desires for transitioning. I simply explained calmly that I know that I'm male, I just wish that I wasn't, and I would feel far more comfortable living as a woman. I argue that I'm already taking the hormones myself, and so I've come to ask them for help in getting an official prescription so that I can do this safely with proper blood monitoring and that sort of thing. With this explanation, they capitulated quickly. I suspect that at the time I did a pretty good job acting as a much saner and more reasonable person than I was at the time, not because of any inherent insufficiency on my part, more the fact that I was literally a extremely young adult that had been on this track since I was a teenager. Next question. You mentioned you were autoandrophobic. What conditioned you to believe this? So, my first trans-related memories are from the age of about 5. I recall feeling weak, insufficient, Male, yes, but in some broken and wrong way. This is not something I judged anyone else for, and I had no issue with less masculine males. I just thought of myself as insufficient because I wasn't more masculine. I suspect this has a lot to do with how badly I wanted my father's approval, and how little of it I actually got. He was always too busy, too interested in other things, and almost all of the things that he wanted to do with me in the time we did have were things that I didn't feel comfortable doing, or at least I didn't find interesting. Stuff like playing and watching sports or going fishing, for example. None of the adult males in my life were aspirational figures to me. None of them led lives or had interests in the kind of things that I was into. I simultaneously felt a need to be accepted by them and yet also had nothing in common with them. Despite our best attempts to connect, nothing really managed to stick. This worsened greatly when my parents divorced at age about 8. My father tried his best to assure me at the time that I was not to blame for the separation, but some part of me didn't quite believe him. If I'm about 50% of my mother and about 50% of my father, and hates my mum enough to leave her, then I'm sure he hates at least 50% of me too per capita. I believe that this perceived abandonment and masculine judgment from the adult males in my life, chiefly my father, led to a self loathing that was too intense to bear as time went on. As a coping method to compartmentalize the pain, I pinned the source of my insufficiency on my maleness. This laid the groundwork for the promise of transitioning to live as a woman to later grip me, in a vice, the moment that I became aware of it as an option. I do think sometimes that I might have offed myself if I didn't transition, but to say that simply implies that transition was a genuinely the right solution. The way that I see it now, transition was a good enough solution that offered me a temporary place to recuperate. It was a subculture, and I remained in that temporary space for far too long, and the addition of unnecessary medicalization has taken its own toll. I want to note now that I do actually have good relationships with my family now on all sides. We've reconciled since, and I've personally apologized for my contributions to how everything went down. And I don't believe that my dad is hateful. I don't even believe that what he did at the time was strictly wrong, and I don't have any specific ill will toward my mum for how it affected her either. Everyone was just doing the best that they could at the time. Next question. How did your decision to transition affect your family and close relationships? My relationships with my family were already incredibly strained to begin with. I was not close to anyone and hadn't been for years by the time I reached the end of high school. Various internet-based subcultures that I was entrenched in through the internet had consumed my whole being. As soon as I finished high school, I fled my mother's house and moved across the country to pursue DIY transition in private, where no one could stop me from doing it. Also, because I already knew that being visibly trans was considered shameful on some level, I had internalized that heavily from all sides of the cultures in my life. I practically cut ties with my friends and family overnight, leading to years of self-segregation, where I only really left the house to meet up with internet friends at in-person events outside of work or shopping trips or that sort of thing. These extended adolescent relationships have overwhelmingly withered away at this stage. It has left me to realize what a mistake it was to neglect my family for this long. My family did their best to try and talk sense to me, and they were genuinely quite nice and sensible about it. I was not beaten, there were no threats, they had nothing to threaten me with, and that's because I ensured that they didn't before I pulled that plug. I recall a conversation with my dad over the phone where he sounded distressed, pleading to me that I recognize that the life path I am choosing is going to include great pain and difficulty that I don't have to go ahead with. In hindsight, he was completely correct. I've since made up with everyone involved, owned up to the sins of my youthful rebellion, but I'll always regret the years and opportunities that I've lost, burned on the pyre of gender transition culture. In recent years, it's become clear to me that my transition was a psychological construct, a false shell that was preventing me from being fully open and honest to make real emotional connections with others, in particular my family. And so I had to begin to dismantle it, deconstruct. I do still have parts that I've retained from my trans persona, and by choice, but there's no barrier left. I feel more connected and engaged with the world than ever before. Question: were you aware of the impact on women's rights, example, to segregated safe spaces? Answer: I didn't think I was doing anything particularly impactful in regards to female rights by transitioning at first. I figured that the old tired stereotype of the predatory, fetishistic trans person was practically a ghost story. Unfortunately, I quickly couldn't deny the reality before my eyes as I encountered very problematic individuals within the trans community, which began to slowly undermine my belief in the movement and the directions it had been heading in. Also, I have since come to realize the damage done to legal, medical, and insurance systems due to the replacement of sex categories with identity categories. Question: have you experienced any permanent physical changes from being medicalized? Answer: yes. Most obviously, I have breasts. They aren't huge, but they are there, though they've somewhat shrunk due to not taking exogenous estrogen anymore for the last 2 or 3 years. Given that I started on exogenous cross-sex hormones when I was 17, I expect to have acquired some amount of brain damage by stunting my full puberty. I don't have the time and money to have my brain scanned to figure that out, but even then, what would it change to know? I believe I've developed some autoimmune systems from my 10 or so years on cross-sex hormones due to the variety of joint pains, lethargy, general inflammation, and persistent weakness that has not resolved despite having fixed my natural hormone levels as best I can. I do not have an official diagnosis for this either, but males taking cross-sex hormones developing autoimmune conditions appears to be common, especially considering the significantly increased rate at which females develop autoimmune conditions in comparison to males. There are probably other lasting effects from my medical transition. We will find out as the field discovers more. Question: if you could go back and talk to your younger self, what would you say to that young boy, and what advice would you give them? Answer: you are not broken. You are not insufficient. You are not evil. You are not destined to become a bad man or a toxic male. You are not barred from achieving a healthy marriage. You do not need to end your life prematurely. You are male, and that's okay. Life is short, and there are far more important things to focus on, like your future family, like your current family. One day, you won't care about any of this anymore, or at least nowhere near as much. You will find peace and be loved. Question: since you've decided to stop medicalizing yourself and detransition, what has been your experience with how that has been received amongst your peers and others? Answer: I have scarcely spoken out about any detransition related things among my trans peers. I did the predictable thing and cut myself off from my prior communities, again, because I had already done my research, again, and I knew that they were not going to be my allies for questioning dominant narratives, let alone outright not believing them anymore, let alone having serious criticisms for the harmful outcomes that are being encouraged. I don't plan on re-engaging with the trans community directly, I don't want to enter their spaces and make them actively uncomfortable without very good reason, and I want to focus my limited time on Earth with efforts that will leave a positive and maximal impact. I recognize I have a proclivity to take on worthy causes with great enthusiasm, which is a double-edged sword. I want to be careful not to charge headlong into detrans activism and spend all my time bickering unproductively with strangers. For my family and what other friends I have kept in my life since pulling back from progressive coded spaces, these relationships have gotten stronger and deeper on average. The false sense of my trans identity was shielding me from making real and full connections with people, including myself. Things simply got easier when I dismantled that false self. Question: if you had a child that believed they were transgender, what would you do to help your child? I would first refrain from letting my children be inculcated unobserved by trans culture. I would teach them about trans people at an age-appropriate fashion, as early as possible. Given how early this gender journey started for me with autoandrophobia at age 5, I expect that potential could be at least partially heritable. On the one hand, I need them to understand the potential for sex-based autophilia and autophobia, and to recognize the connection between those two things. On the other hand, I will teach them that excessive focus on one's self-image and cosmetic embodiment is self-defeating. I hope to impart values of pursuing communal success, starting with the family unit, with an emphasis on reproductive sustainability. Simply, there are more important things in the world than pursuing transition. Question: what inspired you to want to become a parent? Answer: maybe 5 years ago now, I began to realize that if I'm not meaningfully contributing to the propagation of my value system in the world, then I don't actually value the things that I say that I do. I just pretend to for my own strictly selfish benefit. From this realization, I later recognized that reproduction, both genetically and culturally, is a non-optional, foundational platform to this. All human genes and cultures require these to continue to exist. Therefore, I have to attempt to reproduce and to do my part in maximizing my values within the world before my life is over. It helps that I also believe that being a parent will be the most fulfilling pursuit that I ever do, and that is a potential happy benefit. The reality, of course, can vary. I plan to have as many kids of my own as I can, and then continue parenting by fostering once my kids have become independent adults. Thanks for listening to this. I hope to make more soon, at least once a week.